Right, good morning everyone. It really is my pleasure to invite you all here. It's a great group of people, and I know we can probably chat in the back of the room for an hour and a half, but we've got some excellent speakers, so we'll kick things off. And we'll have a little bit of time between speakers and after speakers just to mingle and talk a little bit more. For those of you I don't know, I'm Andrew McLeod. I'm the General Manager of Electricity for PowerCo. So we were very pleased to host this event. I think, like many of you, we are wrestling with what edge technology and new technology and customer choice will mean for our business and for energy markets. So we've been lucky enough to have John Scott and Dr. Lawrence Jones over speaking to our management team and our board over the last couple of days. And it's been a very thought-provoking conversation, and in many ways I know our team's come away quite optimistic about the future and the possibilities, and the fact that everyone really is starting to engage and talk about what's possible collectively. I'll just kick off a little bit with safety now. We've got the whole group here. We've got, if there is a fire alarm, it's a pretty simple out. The elevators in the middle, obviously can't use them. The stairs on either side, just follow your way down the stairs. There are fire wardens to sweep us out. Obviously earthquake, it's stay in the building, and we'll be advised what to do, and when it's clear, we'll go from there. Now, we've got about an hour and a half. I just want to talk quickly about the format. We'll have Dr. Lawrence Jones up shortly. I'll just introduce him. Probably about 30 minutes to 40 minutes. We'll just break in the middle. It's a very light lunch, so just be quick. Then we'll get John Scott up to talk after that. There should be plenty of time, and what I'd encourage you to do is ask questions, use the session. Whilst PowerCo is very happy to host this, these really are the views of some very very influential international speakers. They're not PowerCo's views, so feel free to ask them what you like and use the session as you can. So we might just kick into it and make the best use of the time. I'd like to introduce Dr. Lawrence Jones up. Now, very much a leading voice in the US around smart technology and where it's going and the types of opportunities it portrays. Prior to that, an extensive career in Alstom, so in terms of new technology and bringing that stuff to life. So we spent a couple of hours talking to Lawrence yesterday. Another thing, and hopefully Lawrence gets a chance to talk about it, very strong on us as an industry having a voice and engaging customers and talking about our story. So it'd be great to hear a little bit of that, Lawrence. So I'll welcome you to the stand.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Gee, this is bad. This is a bad start. All right, I'll say good morning to be on the safe side. Well, it's a pleasure being back in New Zealand. I've been here probably about, believe it or not, almost 7 times. First of all, thanks again to PowerCo for inviting me. I used to be, when I came here in my previous life, I was working with Alstom, so I was here back in the day doing a lot of selling of technology to the likes of PowerCo and Transpower and what have you. I've changed jobs. I'm no longer selling technology. I'm now trying to change minds. Technology was easier. Changing minds is more difficult, but I like the challenge. So in my new role as at Edison Electric, I'm Vice President for International Programs. We have about 70 international members ranging from State Grid of China to a small utility in Jamaica. So cover pretty much the whole gamut of policy technology issues. We deal with both investor-owned utilities as well as publicly traded companies as well as state-owned utilities around the world. In the US, Edison is basically an organization with domestic members who are all investor-owned utilities. So a lot of our focus is around getting investors to look at the power sector and working with the policy dimension of it, because our industry, as we well know, is very much driven by regulation and policy. And so a lot of what I will talk about here this afternoon is sort of setting the stage. I see myself as setting the stage for John because he's probably much more, he has much more to lose or gain by getting New Zealand right, since his daughter lives here. I just come here, buy a couple of wines and take back to the States. That's the only reason I come ever so often. But I really like to come here. And I must say that when I got to this time, it was a very long trip, much longer than I typically would take to get here. because for some reason I had to fly from Washington to Toronto and Vancouver to Sydney, from Sydney here. It took me about 28 hours to get here. And my wife said, so how long are you going to be in New Zealand for? I said, well, about 2 days, more or less. And she said, so it'll take you 2 days to get there and 2 days to be there and come back. Very good use of my time. And she jokingly said, make sure you tell the guys from Power Co that every time you come to New Zealand, there are 2 things you bring back: wine and jewelry. So I've made it clear now. So just remember that. But really, I think it's a very interesting country. The reason I've come here so often is because you guys are always on the cutting edge of a lot of things you do. When I was here about 3 years ago with Eric Pyle and Kevin, carrying Divine Care from TransPower, I made a comment that almost got me in trouble when I commented on the fact that you guys were going through this transformation of your electricity sector, and it was just pushed to go back to a single buyer model. And I didn't say anything. I was interviewed by a journalist, and I literally just got the question, and you know, he said, what do you think about New Zealand doing this? And all I said was, why would they want to do that? And the next headline in the newspaper was, you know, Dr. Lawrence Jones looked through his hotel room with a puzzled frown. And the rest of my trip here, I had to walk around with a smile on my face, just to not come across as being angry. So if you see me smiling today, it's because I have to remind myself not to frown. Is there any journalist here? No, because I see the headlines tomorrow. He only smiled this time. So, but anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about the future, and just I want you to think a little bit about this presentation as trying to do what is impossible, and that is to predict the future. And the thing about the future as we look at the grid is there are a couple of things that are evolving. In fact, the customers are evolving, the policy and regulation are evolving, the grid itself, the physics is evolving, as well as the utility business model, and then lastly the investors. So you have all of these forces evolving simultaneously, and then you ask the question, what does the future look like? And that is not an easy question to answer. Clearly we've heard a lot about this notion of smart grids, or the integrated grid, or the intelligent grid. But in essence, what we see happening from a technology standpoint is that we see a convergence of information technology and energy technology coming together. And the fact that they're coming together means that how we've run the grid, how we've used energy, all of this is going to change. The real challenge is, will it change in a way that adds value to the customers and as well as to the investors, add value to society, or will it change in a way that creates more havoc? And who determines that change? Is the change determined by the customers? Is it determined by the regulators? Is it determined by the utilities themselves? These are questions we need to think about. And in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, everyone is trying to figure out how the way forward. What is the pathway for the future with regards to electric distribution? Transmission is somewhat easier in many parts of the world, but distribution is where it really has gotten very, very challenging. So think about it as we go through the presentation in terms of, you know, the transition is going to be driven by the convergence of information technology and energy technology. That's a given. The real challenge is how we deal with some of the other issues I talk about: customers, regulation, policy, and what have you. Now I'm going to show you a couple of slides that gives you a flavor, and I'll give you a background to these slides. But within Edison Electric Institute, we did something last year together with the Edison Foundation, where we had a session called Power in the People, where we brought about 70 to 80 CEOs from around the country, and some from around the world, to have a kind of a roll-up-your-sleeves discussion. And we had these graphic designers or these architects or artists there who were actually capturing the discussion based on their imagination. And this was great because our industry in general, we're very boring, and we have no way to really predict and to present what we do. So we said, instead of us writing a report, let's capture the creativity of these people by an artist. So this is not a power engineering or an engineer who did it. No engineer could have done this beautiful job. But we had these artists who came up with this representation of the conversation. And I want to share some of these with you because it kind of helps you to really understand our challenge as an industry when we talk about the future of the grid. I believe it's not so much a technology issue. It's a communications issue. It's an issue of building trust between stakeholders. It's an issue of understanding that the grid was designed under certain assumptions about universal access, universal service. As we change the paradigm with which the grid has to operate, a lot of things have to change. And part of what will drive the change are the kinds of communication and conversations we have. And we've seen this in the US, where in the beginning you've had a regulator who is there and a utility who's there in terms of their communication style, very combative. And over time, as you bridge the gap and remove the barrier of communication, people begin to find areas of mutual benefits, both for the utilities as well as for the consumers. So you can see here, this is one of the workshops we had, Connected Conversations, where it's all about being able to sit and have a dialogue. And this is what I say now when I travel around the world, when people have this battle between regulators and utilities and consumer groups. I say, have a conversation. Talk about things that are mutually beneficial for not just the utility, but for the society as a whole. And so you see here some of the issues here, what's fair, pricing model for the future. We're not your enemy, we're your partner, right? So there's this perception that, the utilities are against everything and, the consumer advocate groups are against the utility. In fact, there's a partnership that should be built. So you see here, some of the issues that was popping up during this session on the connected conversations, right? The issue of affordability is a conundrum because electricity, we keep saying, should be affordable. But I guess all of you here, if you check your cell phone bills, you're actually paying more for cell phones than you're paying for electricity. But what do you value the most? Your cell phone or your electricity? You will probably say your cell phone until you have a blackout. And that's our dilemma, is that our industry has a commodity that in essence is only valuable when it's not there. Think about it. When the lights go off, everyone values electricity. The rest of the time, people take it for granted. So it makes the commodity difficult to sell because it's only useful when it's not there. And if it's not there, you get penalized as a utility for not having it there. So you have to always have it there. And so how do you value something that is only valued by the consumers when it's not there? Right? So it is a conundrum. All things connected. We've heard about this Internet of Things. We've heard about the connectivity. And I will show one more slide that shows this connectivity. But here again, you see some of the topics that came up during this dialogue. Behaviors, trying to understand how consumers behave. This push that because we connect everything to the distribution grid, people want to get off the grid or people want to use the grid in different ways. Well, it's an assumption. There's no real proof that if you actually give customers access to demand response, they will actually use it to their benefit. We don't know that. So there are a lot of speculation around how customers will react. Customers want, people say what customers want. They want reliable, simple, responsible, high power quality, affordability. Well, is that true? Because if customers want affordability when it comes to electricity, how come they're willing to pay more money for Starbucks or pay more money for their iPhone, but they want to pay less for electricity? Is the issue there that we haven't found a good way to explain the value of electricity for consumers? Or is it that we have regulators that are constantly using electricity as a kind of a means to achieve other political objectives, such as keep the electricity costs low at all costs, right? Again, these are just thoughts and ideas that will feed in the conversation. How do you tell your story as a utility? Right? What are you doing for your customers? How do you explain to them the value of the services you're offering? Right? DG, distributed generation, connected at the home, connected at the grid. What impact does that have on the conversations we need to be having? So when we look at the grid and in terms of connectivity, these are all the technologies. I'm not going to spend time on this because, again, like I said, the issue is not technology. We can build any electrical network from a technology standpoint. That's not a problem. In fact, we have so much technology, we can build a super, super smart, intelligent, pick an acronym, an adjective to describe the grid. The issue is, can we get consumers to use it in a way that they see the value and they're prepared to pay for the value by using the grid? So you see all these technologies. I'll talk about two of them that I think will be interesting from a New Zealand perspective. So DR, the big trend we see, more and more DR is coming online. More PV is being installed. But does it mean that people will defect from the grid? Is the conversation about grid defection or pretense? Is it a reality? Will people actually leave the grid? And if they leave the grid, will they want to come back on the grid? And if they do, what is the price? What's the premium for coming back on the grid? Because if you drive in DC, if you've been to the States and you've taken the plane and you've flown to Dulles Airport, when you're coming from Dulles, there's a toll road. You have a choice. You can take the toll road and pay an additional $5, or you can drive the cheap route and pay $1 and it takes an hour to get into the city. Well, if you choose to get off the grid today because you think you don't need the grid, when you do decide to come back on the grid, the rest of us who've been on the grid the entire time, paying to keep the grid running, keep it maintained, when you come back online, should you just come and just ease onto the grid because you've been gone, or should we penalize you or put a premium on coming back? Will regulators allow that? Should it be done? Is it right? Is it fair? That some people get off the grid all the time and only jump on it when it suits them because they have their PV connection, or should everyone have this fixed charge that you have to pay whenever you use the grid? Renewables. Obviously, a lot of discussions around renewables. Rooftop solar. What is a fact in the US and even now in Europe is that utility scale PV, from a societal perspective, to really achieve the goals of reducing carbon emissions, it's much better to build utility scale solar than to put rooftop all over the place. Now, rooftop might give people independence, but does independence equate to having, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? Again, something we need to ponder as we look to what the future is going to look like. Again, all things connected. Interconnections, a big topic, right? Culture, technology, partnerships. The utility culture has to change, but so does the regulatory culture. There has to be a change in how regulators view the utilities and how utilities view regulators and how customers view the role of utilities. And here you see some of the topics that came up as we talked about all things being connected. I like the one that said portfolio of options. The notion of having options as a customer is great. If you take your iPhone, you have 200 apps of which you only use one, perhaps, or two. My mom has an iPhone, she only uses one, and they want to call me and perhaps send me a text every now and then. But can we do that for the grid? Can we have a grid equivalent to an iPhone, or call it an e-phone or whatever, that allows customers to select from this smart set of applications what it is they want? So today I want less reliability. How do I package my reliability portfolio to say, hey, PowerCo, you should cut my light more today because I don't really need connectivity, but guess what? On Sunday, I want to have electricity the entire time. I will allow some flicker in my distribution system. Can we actually do it? Can we sectionalize the grid so that certain places have more power electronics issues like harmonics than other areas? Because if we cannot, then how do we actually create a commodity of electricity? When we cannot create these different types of services and products that will allow us to differentiate what it is that we have to offer as a service. You have microgrids and other things here you can see from an interconnection discussion. And then we ended up talking about what we call grid talk. And you had a lot of topics coming up from these utility executives. You see everything from, the grid is here to stay. Well, that contradicts those who said the grid is going to go away, right? You had discussions about the fact that you have the utilities wanting to always be connected, but they don't want to always pay to maintain the grid because they assume that maintenance is not something that should cost more, but the value of the service should still be there. People talk about Amazon trying to make a comparison between the utility being a platform that the utility should know the customers in depth. Well, when the utilities ask customers to give them their smart meter data, in the US, for example, it's a big fight. But everyone in this room has given Google right to their information without even knowing. So what is the difference between Google and PowerCo, or Wellington Electricity, or State Grid of China? They're all offering services. So why is it okay to give all your private data to Google, but not give the same private data to the utility? Right? We don't think about it when we do, but we actually end up giving everything to Google. And by the way, when you buy your Nest thermostat, just remember, Google owns the data. And if you ask them to give you your data about your use of electricity in your home, they will tell you no. The reason, because they don't want you to re-engineer the algorithm. Then people don't think about it. So everyone loves Google, everyone hates PowerCo, maybe not, but just use it as an example, right? And then the issue is we have this imbalance in we treat one service provider in the world, Google, different, Uber, different, B&B, different from the utility. So how do we have a level playing field when the utilities get pounded to keep everything affordable, reliable? But then every time I get my electricity bill, my telephone bill from Verizon, it just keeps going up and up. They can bundle their services. The utility wants to bundle the services and offer you refrigeration as a service or lighting as a service. Regulators say no. But guess what? Comcast, they can offer you electricity, they can offer you internet, television, and all the other services. So why we have this imbalance? And then lastly, along grid talk, coming to all the things like analytics, grid optimization, all the more techie stuff. And you can probably tell from some of these sessions which one I really enjoyed, because some of them were more techie than others, right? But that gives you an idea of the flavor of the conversation and the topics that came out of this session. And it was a different kind of a session. It wasn't a session where we're trying to dig deep into technology drivers, but we're trying to capture the imagination of what was being discussed and have it be presented to us by artists. And I present this because I think this is something, even here in New Zealand, in terms of a dialogue, you may want to explore, because oftentimes this chasm that exists between regulators, utilities, and consumers, and advocate groups is because we're not having the right conversation. We're not talking about the right topics. And I think that's something we can do to improve the whole conversation and move to the future. So let me just quickly talk about two technology that I think you'll find interesting. Energy storage and electric transportation. So honestly, you've heard this before, that energy storage, if only we had cheap energy storage, God forbid, my God, we will solve all the electricity problems if we could only store energy. That might be true. But on the other hand, let's remember why we electrified the world. The world wasn't electrified to provide electricity to us as consumers. Let's just say it, don't be sad. The truth is, it was about industrialization. We needed to industrialize the world. So we built these large power stations that will actually provide large amounts of energy to build all of these beautiful things you see around you. Those who say we should move to a completely decentralized world, I've asked a question. How will you design or manufacture 1,000 megawatts of PV? Are you going to use PV to manufacture PV? Or are you going to need base load to manufacture PV? Everybody who says decentralized world has to remind themselves that how much energy do you need to manufacture 10,000 new vehicles? Are you going to do it using distributed energy resources, or do you need base load? I'm not here to answer the question. I'm just here to provoke the thought. So storage is one of those things where we know a lot of applications for storage, from the bulk transmission system all the way down to the consumer side. The interesting thing about storage is a warning. Our industry has a tendency to sort of go blind or assume we can't see what's coming on the horizon, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's there. The price of storage, the cost of storage is going down very, very rapidly. Yesterday, Lazard Investment Group released a new report in New York that showed that the levelized cost of storage is reducing over the next 5 years. It's going to reduce by 5 to 10, 15%. The same thing goes for the levelized cost of just manufacturing storage. So the cost is going down. The uptake is going to come. We're seeing different areas where storage can be used within the utility space. But there are still uncertainty around the value proposition for storage because of the cost structure, but also because of the regulatory concerns. Should utilities own storage? Should they do it behind the meter? Or should they do it only, upstream? How does that affect the uptake? Because again, without utility scale storage, you will not have the reduction in cost we want. So should we just rely on residential storage? Will that be enough to bring down the cost, or do we need to look at other mechanisms to allow utility scale storage to be involved in this discussion? Electric transportation, kind of a sister child or sister to storage in a sense. There's some inherent storage in it. And so the issue there with transportation is, as we've seen, it creates an opportunity for the utility industry, because we've seen load flatten, and with electric transportation, there's a lot of good benefits for the utility sector. Now, I know everybody else would say, well, that's just good for the utility. What about the rest of us? Well, you'd be surprised. Let me just skip here. If you look at electricity as a fuel, you realize that the cost of electricity, the cost of using your vehicle with electricity as a fuel is by far cheaper, even with taxes considered, than using other forms of fuel for transportation. So in terms of the benefits of society, not only will it lead to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, it will also actually lower the cost of transportation. The more we start putting electricity, not just in the transportation sector for residential transportation, but as has been done in some parts of the US, using it even in the whole electrification of the fleet of supply in different utilities, everything from your bucket trucks and buses for commercial transportation. So this push towards electrification of transportation is something we see coming. We already have 77 member companies in the US who have all kinds of programs for getting their employees and getting others involved in using electric transportation. We have a partnership we've signed with the Department of Energy, Edison and DOE, looking at how to accelerate the deployment. And there again, interesting, you have the government and the private sector. Typically people will say EI will never work with the government will never work with EI. Again, that's just, talk. In essence, there's a lot of collaboration going on, and we have this MOU with the DOE working on this. Let me end by just looking at the convergence here, policy, and I know John will get into some of this, the technology of the customer. All of these things have to converge. And so the drivers are converging. And then I ask the question, policy. What are the public policy that will shape the future of electric distribution going forward? What are some of the questions? I'm not answering these questions, I'm just posing the questions here for the sake of conversation. How do we go about doing planning? How do we address the issue of the design and construction? Who is best suited to operate the grid? Can utilities own and should they own distributed energy resources behind the meter? How do you build trust between the utilities? And how do utilities get incentive to make investments and take risk in innovation? These are some of the public policy issues that are being discussed. And so as we look forward, understanding what are the overall objective of a utility, you want to meet all the demands of consumers, you want to meet the policy goals for the society. But then I put this in red because it must all be done at as lower costs to consumer. And I will end on a little provocative note. Why must it be at a lower cost? Why? This is the only industry that we're constantly told that the commodity must be made cheaper. But if the service and the value of electricity is by far the greatest thing to society, shouldn't it be that we put greater value on electricity and let actually consumers pay for what they value, instead of us putting all kinds of caps around the prices and putting caps around the costs or what have you? Isn't that something we should maybe think about? And not just emphasize lower costs, but let's find a way to explain and describe the value proposition of electricity for consumers, and maybe that will make things better. How the utility business model looks in the future, I believe it's going to be more of a network. It has to be that way. And as it becomes a network, it will create a lot of opportunities for people to get involved. And we have to be very careful how we design regulation to make sure that we don't create a lot of unintended consequences, such as people bypassing the utility to go elsewhere to get their services, but then what happens, the utilities will not have enough revenue to do the maintenance and operation of the grid. Vice versa, we have to make sure that utilities offer the services they say they're going to offer, and they're held accountable to different regulatory mechanisms. So the possible pathways: do they become a system integrator? Do they just operate the grid? Or do they become a full service provider? Whatever role they end up playing will be determined not just by the consumers, but by regulation, by customers, and also by the role that an investors feel they should play. So to sum up here, I think we're going to have these drivers of technology, public policy, and customer expectations. They will keep changing, which means the future is really not 100% certain. What we do know is that things like energy storage, transportation, they're all coming. They're on the horizon. They will soon be here. We'll maximize the benefits of all of this in a network environment. And then lastly, I think the future grid is hybrid. It's going to be both centralized and decentralized. And I've had discussions with my colleagues in Europe who are very pro-distributed generation and the ones who are very pro-centralized. And I stand in the middle because at the end of the day, we'll have both centralized and decentralized systems. And I think that's the most optimal solution. So with that, I think I've run out of my...
5 minutes for questions.
I even have my knees left, so I didn't believe that. All right, thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
That's really excellent, thanks. And the focus is absolutely on electricity, new technologies. I'm a gas guy, and Andrew stood up before. He's an electricity guy, but he used to be a gas guy. Powerco's got some gas networks they're thinking about. Do you have any themes you'd weave in there about, say, utility providers provide multiple options, retailers are offering multiple fuels? Is there a gas theme around that?
There is a gas theme around that. If you've been following the news in the U.S., Duke Energy recently bought a gas company. Duke Energy is one of the largest transmission companies in the U.S. They just invested in gas. Dominion investing in gas. So we're beginning to see a trend where more and more large utilities in the U.S. are hedging their portfolio by now investing in gas. Obviously, gas is cheap, but gas has a lot of advantages. So I think you'll begin to see this convergence. Where I think is a challenge is that I would argue, and I'll leave it to the gas guys to disagree, I think electricity is by far down the road of using new technology when it comes to sensoring and call it smart grid. So I think smart gas is a little bit behind, but I think there is a convergence. The other thing happening in the U.S., especially in the northeastern part of the U.S., is that as much as there's a lot of gas, there is not enough gas infrastructure. And so now there's a discussion about harmonizing the electricity market and the gas market, where you bring the two together from a wholesale perspective, not on the retail side yet, but on the wholesale side. The other place I would go to have this conversation around, you said gas, but if you extend it to even, the district heating, if you go to places like Denmark, where now they're perhaps one of the few countries that are taking a real good energy system perspective, not just looking at electricity, they're looking at energy system from all dimensions. So they have a 20-30 plan for the entire energy system, including gas, district heating, transportation, optimizing the entire thing, and including even the use of hydrogen. So I think you're beginning to see it happen in the U.S. now, and I think we'll see more of that. Yes?
In coming to meet these challenges of new technologies, often requires changes to regulation, also changes to consumers' prices. Are there any examples of where that's been handled well? Jurisdictions where it's been handled well in making those changes, and conversely, areas where they haven't been able to make the necessary changes.
So one of the things I try not to do is to say places that are well and places that are not well. I can tell you off the record, because nowadays everything I do is tweeted, so I get in trouble all the time. But I would say that there are case studies. Edison Electric, for example, we've worked with states within the U.S. that have done a lot of work around redesigning the rate structure. Right, that's a big issue. I know that in Australia, there's a big push to redesigning the overall rate structure in Australia. I know you have something in New Zealand similarly to examine your pricing scheme and your pricing structures. In terms of what works and what doesn't, I think it's very risky to start to take a model that works somewhere else and try to just apply it. What I have found is that the politics of electricity oftentimes has a greater impact on the modeling and the execution of these different models than the actual model. So you can take feed-in tariffs. They were done in Germany, they were done in Spain, they were done in parts of this part of the world. But if you look at what happened in all of those cases, politics had their hand in the outcome. I think we run the risk of the same thing happening with pricing schemes for electricity, so that whereas a model that may have worked in Western USA in California, if you try to bring it over to New York, you have a different political landscape and people may come in and manipulate and do things. I think that's something we need to think about with regards to regulation, even in New Zealand. As you guys look at your pricing structure, how do you keep the hands of politics, not the regulators? The regulators are not bad guys. Is there a regulator here? Good, I said a good thing, perfect. So the regulator is not a bad guy. But it's the politics around the pricing scheme, right, that I think we need to be aware of. Eric.
So Lawrence, let's explore that a little further. On the one hand, you've got solar coming in, and that sort of pushes people into thinking about fixed charges. And on the other hand, people like me and others own EVs, and we come home at 5 o'clock and charge our EV, and that will massively increase the peak load. Therefore, that pushes you down a time of use type charging structure. Can you sort of explore those
Yeah,
points in
yeah.
relation to your last?
No, I think that you bring up a valid point, because there's people like you who will cause the trouble because of your electric transportation.
That's
Right?
just me, right?
I know, but it's good, because what happens is it raises the question: is peak pricing the best way to go to address some of the issues you bring up, or is time of use a better approach, right? And I think that the jury is still out. What I think we need to do, and I would recommend to New Zealand, is, don't be afraid of having pilot projects where you actually experiment and test these different models. One of the things that we did in the US when President Obama came to office, he started these stimulus projects to really prototype and experiment. New York is doing a similar thing now with the REV, where they're trying to experiment with different types of pricing models. We need to try and be willing to simulate and experiment with different kinds of pricing schemes, because I can guarantee you, Eric, peak pricing, you can set it up now. All it takes is one major disruption in something that will make peak pricing not function. And everyone says peak pricing is wrong, it's not great. So I think we shouldn't try to find a panacea solution to these problems. We need to take a holistic approach and ask two questions. One, who's costing the cost to go up? And two, who's going to pay for that cost going up? And we need to be transparent. So you take rooftop PV, for example. Most people who want rooftop PVs are well off. Live in very wealthy society, communities like Eric, right? Rich people, right? People who can't afford it, people like Andrew, right? These guys are struggling, right? So what happens then is, Eric doesn't want to pay his costs. He wants to get off the grid. He wants to charge only when it suits him. So he rushes home doing this sort of a low, when it's cheap, charges his PV, takes the bus, come back into the city, and then the moment it gets expensive to sell his power back, he plugs his power back onto the grid and sells his power back to the grid. So he's actually making more money because he's using the public transport system like he did today to come here, and then he plugs in to make more money. So I think we need to look at who is really benefiting from some of these pricing schemes when we put them in place.
You've outlined very well that there's a collective problem or a collective opportunity or a collective challenge. And I'm wondering, is there a collective solution? Obviously the Institute has put a lot of thought leadership into this, but I'm just wondering, is there a single entity which would be appropriate for looking at the collective solution? And if there was that entity, what would it look like? I mean, you might say it's the Institute, right? But it might not be the Institute. So what would be that entity to think of a collective solution?
It's not an easy thing, right? Look, and I'll give you one example, COP21, okay? We're trying to bring too many disparate ideas together to solve a problem. I think the collective solution shouldn't be one of solving the ultimate problem. It should be one of sharing best practices, convening people together like we're doing here to have a dialogue, and then maybe creating what I call cross-national themes where people can begin to have an open and transparent dialogue. There is something called the Energy Transition Forum. It's based at the University of Columbia. I'm on the advisory board. We meet and we have these very candid conversations on all kinds of things about the grid. Eventually we realize that we're saying the same thing, but the problem is nobody wants to give. Nobody meaning everyone wants to stand on their position. I think the real challenge is how do we begin to look for consensus around energy pricing, for example, where it's not just the utility guys that are bad, and it's not just the Teslas who are bad, and there's not going to be any death spiral of the utility. Because remember, the death spiral of the utility discussion, who killed it? Elon Musk. He killed it when he came and said he would need the utilities going forward because he believes that not his home pact, but his electric pack, the battery pack for the wall, that would actually be more important for him. So partnerships have to be the way to go. So I don't think there's a single entity. Now, I would, with all due respect, say that in terms of convening powers, I would say that an organization like Edison, with the largest utilities around the world and the smaller ones, can convene. But do they have the solution? No. Convene and let's have a dialogue. One last question. I see lunch coming, and I'm always excited when I see lunch. Any other questions?
Can you talk to the challenge of getting the consumer viewpoint and the consumer groups, getting them into this conversation?
Yeah.
So that they feel sort of validly part of it and owning whatever pops out.
Yeah. And that, I think that's a very valid question. I think what has happened is, at Edison we've worked on this, we have this thing called well, we didn't start it, but we were part of it, a sort of a consumer collaboration forum that brings together utilities, consumer groups, investors, and then and have a dialogue, right? I think the problem is, as an industry, and let's be self-critical of the utility industry, we have allowed others to write our story. So people say the utilities hate distributed generation. The utilities hate rooftop PV. When you actually check, utilities actually have invested most in renewables than any off-grid solution. If you look at the numbers, utilities have invested most in distributed energy resources. But the perception is because we are engineers, most of us, with the exception of the other regulators, the rest of us are engineers, and we don't know how to sell ourselves. So we have a struggle of the narrative, and the narrative has always been, you guys are against change. You guys are the dinosaurs. We're beginning to change that discussion. On the consumer advocate side, utilities have to not just see them as, those the tree huggers, whatever the derogatory statement used to be. People need to now find common ground, right? And it's not easy because everyone is stuck in their position, right? And say, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, right? I remember when I came here about 2 years ago with Andy Ott, you were having a discussion about your single buyer model. And I remember when we first got here, my good friend Eric, who helped to host us, he was panicking. He's like, Lawrence, these guys are tearing themselves apart, and whatnot. By the time we left, I don't know the name of the politician, maybe you know who he was, but the guy who was on the left and the guy who was on the right, they sent an email back to Eric basically saying, thanks for bringing those guys here. Because we're able to reach some sort of a consensus by telling them, look, the single buyer model is not going to be good in the long term. You may have a short-term political win. The best bet is fix the market, tweak the market, and let the market continue to evolve. And so I think finding these common points for dialoguing is the best approach. Incorporating the consumer advocates is also one way to go, and letting them feel that the utilities are not just out there to get them. Last comment I'll make, just for the record, you probably heard of that Exelon was trying to buy Petco, the big utility in DC, right? The deal went south, and eventually Exelon realized what was going wrong. They had not incorporated the consumer advocates in the discussion early on, as they've done in other states, right? And so we need to, as a utility industry, find a way to embrace everybody around the table and allow the utilities, the regulator should allow the utilities to make reasonable profit. And it should be okay to make profit because they're taking a huge risk. You're asking them to invest in technology, and if the technology doesn't work, they have stranded costs. So that's what I would say.